B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, October 16th, 2019. Outside Columbus, Ohio last night, the home of one of our favorite listeners and supporters, Carl Howard. 12 Democrats took to the stage for another corporate-run debate that is just so frustrating to watch. This time sponsored by CNN and the New York Times. And the guy from the New York Times, I've got his name here somewhere. I'll get to it in a while, but he was truly annoying. And the way they managed the whole debate process, as usual, the perceived front runner gets the most time to talk, and the others have to elbow their way in. And in the opening sequence, they first started talking about impeachment. No real surprises there. It was kind of a warm-up. Tulsi Gabbard, who is one of the few who had questions or caution about impeachment, says that the Ukraine saga changed it for her. Then they shifted to a very brief interchange with Joe Biden about his son Hunter, the arrangements in Ukraine, where Hunter served on the board of Burisma, and Joe strong-armed the government at the time to fire a prosecutor. And Joe was permitted to spin it up, say that he'd done nothing wrong, Hunter did nothing wrong, Hunter speaks for himself. He gave an interview to ABC. Hunter speaks for himself. And then he tried to pivot to Trump's own corruption. And what was really frustrating was that the moderators then turned to Bernie Sanders, who declined to attack Biden on this and shifted. He pivoted to other topics. And then, as we expected to hear from at least a handful of the other candidates, the moderators rather brazenly and, in a muscular way, changed the topic to try to pin down Elizabeth Warren. This is the fourth debate straight that they have been doing this. And we heard Beto O'Rourke, I could identify his voice, and others who were protesting that they wanted to talk about the Biden situation. So this is a clear case where CNN and the New York Times decided they could not avoid asking Biden to comment. But when he gave a non-answer, they did follow up once. But they allowed Bernie to basically evade the topic and then never return to it. And it's that kind of protection for a damaged front runner that the media hasn't learned from 2016. There's this idea that if you ask too many questions about this, you're feeding Trump's talking points and damaging the candidate. But if he can't withstand questions from friendly moderators and criticism from other Democrats, it would only be more withering should Biden be the nominee and face Trump in a debate. And by the way, we have no guarantee that Trump will actually debate. Now, his ego would require him, I think, to do so, but it is possible that he could say, I would actually gain more by not going out there and doing my dance. So, as I mentioned, they pivoted then to attack Elizabeth Warren. And at last night's debate, they set up Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, and to some extent Joe Biden as the conservative Democrats who are supposed to criticize Warren because she won't quite say that middle-class taxes will have to be raised to pay for Medicare for all. And she doesn't want to do that because it'll be a soundbite that Republicans will run in commercials. So she's being strategic, but it makes her look defensive and evasive. And that's what Pete Buttigieg went after. And he defined himself as really more Republican than Democrat. He talked about a Medicare for all who want it. And nobody bothered to point out that, the way insurance risk pools are set up, if you allowed people to opt into Medicare without, further shoring up the Medicare system, you could have a very uneven distribution of healthy and unhealthy people. And that could make costs very difficult to control. So the obsession of the media with really trying to play gotcha with Elizabeth Warren and force her to answer that led to these lengthy and tedious exchanges. Klobuchar calling Medicare for All a pipe dream. And Pete Buttigieg saying that Americans want choice with subsidies and that this would obliterate private plans. And that, of course, is the number one talking point of Republicans and the health insurance industry. Bernie, after, I think, getting as frustrated as I was, kind of cut through and he said, do Democrats have any guts? He's tired of people defending a broken system. And he singled out the profits of the insurance company and the pharmaceutical industry. That's insurance companies, I meant to say. And so I do believe that Bernie showed that his heart attack has not slowed him down. He wasn't yelling quite as much last night, and so he didn't come off as angry as in a previous debate. And Joe Biden, by many accounts, was seen as the angry man last night. Andrew Yang got a lot of face time. His universal basic income of $1,000 a month, he was able to describe it. He put it in the context of a federal jobs program that's part of the Sanders package and also linked to the Green New Deal. Elizabeth Warren said, universal basic income could be managed by Social Security. And we could expand, for example, Andrew Yang points out that his wife stays home to take care of 2 kids. And Warren addressed that rather directly, saying that she would favor covering Yang's wife for being a homemaker and a stay-at-home mom, and that not only would she receive money from Social Security, but also she would be contributing to her own Social Security retirement account. So these are all interesting ideas, and this is what I want to see from a debate like this. But because the gatekeepers are intent on filtering what they consider to be dangerous, liberal, progressive, or socialist ideas, the whole tenor of it is just so frustrating. Now, I have to confess that last night my DVR failed me. I watched the first hour of the debate live, and then I had to go to the TV studio and record a couple of interviews. And when I came back, the DVR had missed about 30 minutes of it. At any rate, I picked up on the segment where the question was placed to the elders on the stage, Biden, Sanders, and Warren, that you're going to be even more elderly if you get elected. And then they turned to Tulsi Gabbard and said, hey, you're the youngest. And while noting the ageism of the question to her colleagues, she said that she kind of pivoted to a whole discussion about being a commander-in-chief. Along the way, I don't know if it was in that particular answer, but Tulsi Gabbard gave a great critique of the New York Times' recent smear of her. And also, while live on CNN, she hammered CNN for a commentary that I didn't see, but that questioned her patriotism and called her an asset of Russia. And that apparently was broadcast sometime yesterday, just hours before this debate. So I give Tulsi credit. In that particular answer, she talked a little too long, and then she was getting cut off as she tried to deliver a challenge to Elizabeth Warren, asking her if she supports regime change wars. And I was pleased to hear the strongest statement about the Middle East from Elizabeth Warren, who said, we don't belong there. She wants to get our troops out. And then in a slam at Trump, she said she wanted to do it the right way. And, well, I don't disagree with any of those, but it is one of the most explicit statements on foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East that we've heard from Senator Warren. And as you know, I find her foreign policy weaknesses of concern, and I think that she played a good card last night. One of the other interesting exchanges that everybody else in the media commentary zone is dismissing or criticizing was when Kamala Harris asked Elizabeth Warren to join her in demanding that Twitter shut down Trump's account. And Warren pivoted and said, well, I don't want to shut down his account. I want to boot him out of the White House. But I support Harris on this, as you know. I think that when you talk about breaking up Facebook and Google, that you have to include the damage that Twitter has done. And the way Trump can bypass the media and lie to 62 million people 10 times a day? And so I think Kamala Harris, who ducked a question about Medicare for all by trying to promote her feminist bona fides and talk about abortion rights, I thought that was a moment when Harris distinguished herself. But it seems like I'm in a distinct minority. Now, one of the other remarkable comments came from Pete Buttigieg, who has advanced proposals, broad proposals, he hasn't defined them explicitly, about reforming the Supreme Court by expanding the number of justices. And he floats the number of 15, saying there's a study, I think, at Yale right now. And his way of balancing the partisanship on the Supreme Court would be that the first 10 justices would be appointed on a partisan basis. The sitting president gets to appoint, and the Senate confirms or denies. And he says the last 5 justices would have to pass another level of scrutiny, which is that the other 10 justices would all have to approve of these 5, who would then be presumed to be less partisan or even nonpartisan. Well, I have to think about this, but number one, I give Buttigieg credit for advancing a novel concept for us to chew on, and it is something worth considering. Now, Biden, I thought this was a moment where his experience served him well. He said, if we do that, the next time a Republican is in office, they're just going to appoint their people, and it's just going to seesaw back and forth. So I think that was a valuable moment. It also led to Joe Biden making a claim when he was pressed essentially to criticize the progressives in the race, that I'm the only one who's gotten big things done. And that's where he swung at Elizabeth Warren, telling her don't be vague about what Medicare for all would cost. And Biden ticked off big things he'd done. And then Bernie Sanders just lowered the boom on him. And he called him my friend and then said, Joe, you got some big things wrong. Iraq, the bankruptcy law, China trade, the crack bill from the 1990s. And then he closed that with a pretty inspiring call to stand up for Medicare for all. There was also an exchange between Biden and Warren where she took credit for the heavy lift of creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau under President Obama. And that was a big project, and I give her a lot of credit for that. And so Biden tried to diminish it by saying, well, I got votes for you on the consumer agency. And Liz Warren had a very interesting answer. She said, well, I'm grateful to President Obama and everyone else who did anything, even small, to help pass that bill. And the record is clear that Biden didn't do too much, and he is gilding the lily here. So one of the other things that became clear to me is that Pete Buttigieg is a war hawk. He embraces neocon principles. And I have to say it was disappointing to see them all play the Syria narrative in the expected Beltway manner, which is to say this is a big Trump blunder. The Kurds have been abandoned and all that stuff that we've been talking about here for days. But what I thought was interesting is that Buttigieg really showed many, many interesting stripes. And one of them is his naivete, because he and others attacked Warren for fighting for Medicare for all, fighting to reduce college loan debt and things like that. And Warren uses the language of fight. And Buttigieg says, well, in a post-Trump America, we can't be fighting. We have to, go for unity and moderation. And to some extent, Klobuchar says the same thing. And I don't think it has any traction. Oh, it's a nice, warm and fuzzy feeling. I support unity. But with Trump and the Republicans operating the way they are, I'm sorry. That is a very naive position to take. Now, I have a stack of papers in front of me, and forgive me, but this will be a little random. I'm going to quote from some of the commentary of others and, share my reaction to it. Elizabeth Warren's non-answer to tax increases for the middle class to pay for Medicare for all ended this way: I will not sign a bill into law that does not lower costs for middle-class families. And Sanders does say, I think it's appropriate to acknowledge that taxes will go up. And this led to this kind of ganging up on Elizabeth Warren. Now, I think her answer is sufficiently clear, but I do also understand that she appears to be dodging it. And I explained she just doesn't want that video clip to be played a million times if she is the nominee. I'm now looking at a New York Times recap of the debate, and I find a number of things interesting. They play up Amy Klobuchar as the adult in the room who denounced Medicare for all as a pipe dream. Beto O'Rourke, responding to the wealth tax proposed by Warren, called her overly punitive. And that's part of that same idea that, we can all just kumbaya, and the Trump rebels, who had voted for Obama in 2012 will come back to the fold. I'm sorry. That is wishful thinking and whistling right past the graveyard. I've already mentioned the Joe Biden exchange. And in several media accounts, the articles say that nobody else commented on this. Well, it's because they weren't permitted to, because the moderators changed the topic over the objections of at least one, if not other, candidates. Also, I will note that in a 4-page recap of this, the New York Times didn't find space to mention that Tulsi Gabbard had criticized them for the recent smear that was published in the paper on Sunday. They do mention that she said that it was not only Trump who had the blood of the Kurds on his hands, but also politicians in both parties and news media organizations that had cheered for regime change war. In the Washington Post, they make an oblique reference to her criticism of the media. But this is par for the course. That, I think Gabbard showed some courage in addressing this head on. She didn't stumble or stammer or appear nervous or sweaty. I am prepared to say at this point that Tulsi Gabbard will not be the nominee for president or vice president in 2020. But she made a singular contribution in exposing Pete Buttigieg and his hawkish tendencies in an exchange that the two carried on, where Buttigieg said that Gabbard was dead wrong, arguing that the slaughter going on in Syria is not a consequence of American presence, it is a consequence of a withdrawal. So he doesn't address the dirty origins of the U.S. troop deployment in Syria, the fact that they're sitting ducks at this point, and the real betrayal is Turkey. And it was Obama and his national security team who brought Turkey into this clusterfuck in Syria. But none of that, just like, when they talk about Ukraine, the history of the U.S.-backed coup there never gets exposed. They always color with their little crayons inside the line. Again, quoting from the New York Times summary here, Warren was on the defensive for much of the evening and most of all on the issue of single-payer health care. See, that's contrived. And the New York Times editor, who was on the stage with Anderson Cooper and Aaron Burnett, I believe, was one of the reasons for that. When you look at the elapsed time each candidate got, Warren 22 minutes, Biden 16, Klobuchar 13, Beto 13, Sanders 13, Buttigieg 13. Now, if they assign, the speaking times based on standing in the polls, Beto O'Rourke should not be number 4 in exposure at the debate. That list is followed by Harris at 12 minutes, Booker at 11, Yang at 8, Castro at 8, and Gabbard at 8. The billionaire Tom Steyer didn't really get to talk about climate change because the moderators didn't bring it up. He worked in a couple of references in other answers, but he got a mere 7 minutes of speaking time. Over at The Intercept, they're focused on Joe Biden's uneven performance last night. They quote his response to the softball question about Hunter Biden and Ukraine. He said, "Look, my son did nothing wrong." He eventually veered into George Washington's famous farewell address, and he fumbled his attempt to quote from that. They say his most aggressive moment in the debate was his most cringeworthy. After he claimed he was the only person on the stage who got big things done, Warren noted that she had ushered in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Biden responded by claiming loudly that he had gone to the Senate and secured votes for it. And that claim is dubious at best, says The Intercept, and I agree with them on that. And other than that, their commentary is pretty predictable. Now, over at the New York Times, they put together brief statements from their opinion page contributors. And I'm just going to cite a couple of them, all right? Jamel Bouie, talking about Joe Biden. At the halfway point, I had Biden at about a 5 or 6 on a 10 scale, but then he tried to claim credit for that Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and yelled at Warren about it. It was one of the most unbecoming moments of the primary thus far. So Jamel Bouie gives a 3 out of 10 for Biden's score. Then Bianca Vivian Brooks, Biden's unintelligibility proved that he remains a logical choice only for Americans who prefer a figurehead statesman to a truly effective leader. America is moving on. And I agree. I think that this was the debate where Joe Biden is on the descent and Warren and to some extent Sanders have upside potential. Now, in talking about Kamala Harris, here are the comments that I don't agree with. Ross Douthat. Her attempt to shame Warren over the question of whether Twitter should suspend Trump was just another weird choice in her candidacy's weird decline. Michelle Goldberg. She didn't get nearly enough time, which made her decision to dwell on Trump's Twitter account all the more baffling. And Nick Kristof. Some great answers, but lost me by picking a fight over Trump tweets. Now, I really think that is a substantial issue about the role of tech firms in the political discourse in our country today. And Trump has clearly violated their standards repeatedly. Harris was actually generous in the citations that she made about Trump's bad boy behavior on Twitter. Okay, and there's one more. Will Wilkinson, who's a conservative. Harris showed flashes of strength, but her intensity can collapse into a casualness both charming and weird. Her attack on Trump's Twitter account was odd. Okay. Now to Joe Biden. Charles Blow says a 7 out of 10 score. Bless his heart, it feels like he's just hanging on for dear life. At moments, it felt like he vanished, not just because it wasn't his time to speak, because his aura of invincibility is flickering like a candle in a hurricane. On Amy Klobuchar, Melanie Price gives a 1 out of 10. She is working so hard to win Republicans and independents that she is losing Democrats. I'll say amen to that. And Daniel McCarthy gave Pete Buttigieg a 7 out of 10. Bizarre plan to pack the Supreme Court. Notwithstanding, he was the strongest Republican on stage. Not my kind of Republican, but the kind that Democrats might do well to welcome. Well, that is exactly my point. It's nice to see someone else make it. Let's see what else I got. I'm looking at the Washington Post coverage now. Again, they say no one on stage wanted to criticize Hunter Biden's foreign buck-raking. They weren't permitted to. That simply isn't true. In the short term, they say the pile-on helps Warren. And they quote her saying, I understand that this is hard, but I think as Democrats, we're going to succeed when we dream big and fight hard, not when we dream small and quit before we get started. So I think she really did perform very well last night. And as I said, her comment, I've got the quote here, I think we ought to get out of the Middle East. I don't think we should have troops in the Middle East, but we have to do it the right way, the smart way. Well, that's not comprehensive, but it's a step in the right direction. Also, we have learned that AOC, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib of the vaunted squad have all announced that they will be endorsing Bernie Sanders. And that is a setback for Elizabeth Warren. And I would say it's payback because she did not support Bernie Sanders in 2016. And I applaud these young upstarts for having the courage to back Sanders. Over at the Washington Post, Margaret Sullivan criticizes the media. And here is the name of that New York Times guy. He's a national editor named Mark Lacey. And I don't have anything good to say about Mark Lacey's performance last night. Sullivan does ding them for not asking about climate change. They also didn't talk about housing and homelessness, which are critical issues for many in this country. And they used gotcha approaches to gun control, trying to make Beto O'Rourke seem absolutely crazy for calling for buybacks of so-called assault weapons. And the intense focus on trivial issues related to health care proposals is just annoying. At USA Today, an opinion columnist, Jason Sattler, says that Bernie Sanders won the debate. He returned to the campaign trail after his heart attack to deliver his strongest debate performance of the campaign. He was lively, funny, and persuasive. At one point, he even seemed to convince billionaire Tom Steyer that billionaires shouldn't exist. And I don't agree with his comment here. The format of the debate followed much better than the previous three. It's unclear as if this is because of the moderators or because self-help guru Marianne Williamson wasn't on the stage. And I want to quote from a Facebook friend named Camille. She writes, "Having meditated to control my retching reflexes in order to watch the fourth Democratic debate for the sole purpose of seeing the best candidate for president, Tulsi Gabbard, what I saw was more censorship, desperate smears against her. What she said last night was correct. There is a concerted effort to attack her in the mainstream media, and they went to great extent to vilify her as a traitor and a Russian asset, and associated her with deplorables like libertarians and conspiracy theorists." Those are quotes from the New York Times. "This indicates to me," Camille says, "that she is the best candidate for America because the mainstream media is an asset of the military-industrial complex." Thank you, Camille. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. On my list today, Stuart Russell, Andrew Rush, Brian Mazzy, and I turn the page here, Faith Peoples. Thanks to each and every one of you for your ongoing support of my work. And if you're not currently a subscriber, can you take the hint? Drop by peterbcollins.com. Take a look, and you'll see the menu button. Then you've got the Become a Subscriber page or link. It takes you to the sign-up page, and you can make a choice of $5, $10, $20 a month or a $50 annual subscription, and you have my gratitude in advance. Now to our impeachment file for today. It centers a lot about Rudy Giuliani, and based on leaks from anonymous White House officials who clearly feel pissed at Rudy Giuliani's freelancing, they are now exposing that he repeatedly demanded that Trump deport Fethullah Gulen. Now, he is the Turkish imam in self-imposed exile in Pennsylvania. He is most likely a CIA asset or informant. And Joe Laria, my friend and the editor at Consortium News, he's the only one I know who has ever interviewed Fethullah Gulen. And it's funny to watch American anchors try to pronounce his name, Fethullah Gulen, and things like that. Anyway, he has been a widget subject to being traded to Turkey because Erdogan believes that he organized the failed coup in 2016. That could be true. I don't know that to be true, and we've seen no evidence for it. But it appears that Giuliani picked up on Mike Flynn's illegal lobbying for Turkish interests that occurred during the 2016 campaign before he was installed as National Security Advisor. And at one point, Flynn was saying that Turkey would pay $15 million in bounty for the return of Fethullah Gulen. So the leakers say that Giuliani was at times so insistent that a number of White House officials came to believe he was secretly lobbying for Turkey, so they checked the lobbying records to see if he was registered, and he wasn't. Giuliani denies all this. He says, that'd be totally crazy. I couldn't have gotten Gulen extradited. What would I have gotten in? Why would I have gotten involved? It's definitely untrue. I had nothing to do with Gulen. Also, yesterday, Giuliani's one-time lawyer, John A. Sale, who quit after he wrote an angry letter to the House Intelligence Committee saying that Giuliani would not be handing over documents to the impeachment investigation because the information was beyond the scope of legitimate inquiry and a violation of attorney-client and executive privilege. And shortly after that was delivered, Giuliani tweeted that, I don't need a lawyer, and Sale is no longer representing me. Pete Sessions, a former knuckle-dragging Republican congressman from Texas who is hoping to recover his seat in the House next November, has been issued a subpoena by the federal grand jury in New York that is looking into Giuliani and his two cronies, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman. In addition, we know that the fourth of the individuals who are implicated in the Giuliani scheme, David Correa, was arrested as he arrived at JFK Airport earlier today. And the fourth defendant, Andrew Kukushnin, along with the other guys, are supposed to appear in federal court in Manhattan tomorrow. There is other news today. Turkey has rebuffed U.S. calls for a ceasefire in northeastern Syria as it pressed ahead with an offensive targeting the Syrian Kurdish militants. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the strongman leader of Turkey, said that Kurdish fighters should drop their weapons and withdraw from designated border areas by nightfall to halt the fighting. And despite that ultimatum, the fighting continues. Erdogan rejected a U.S. offer to broker a truce, and there are confusing comments about whether or not he's willing to meet with Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo when they arrive in Turkey tomorrow. And Trump is continuing to say that he made the right decision. And as you know, I think he bungled the process badly, but I have to agree with him. It's long past time for the U.S. to pull out of Syria. Let's see. Michael McKinley, former senior advisor to Mike Pompeo, is up on the Hill today. He issued, or somebody leaked, his opening statement. He is very concerned about the way career diplomats have been mistreated at the State Department, and he opposed the removal of Marie Yovanovitch as the ambassador in Ukraine. Also on the impeachment front, we are learning that Mick Mulvaney, who is the acting White House chief of staff, he's been acting for 10 months now and may never get the job permanently. He appears to be the guy who engineered the kind of separate tracks between the Giuliani team, which included Gordon Sondland. He's supposed to be interviewed tomorrow. Kurt Volker, who was there a couple of weeks ago, plus Rick Perry. And Mulvaney apparently worked to keep them from contact with John Bolton and to keep Bolton from knowing that Trump and Mulvaney approved of the activities of the Giuliani group in Ukraine. And as we reported yesterday, John Bolton is the unlikely potential hero in exposing the scheming that has been going on in the Trump White House. I mentioned Gordon Sondland and his the expectation that he will be interviewed on Capitol Hill tomorrow, and we've learned more from Fiona Hill's interview. She didn't accuse Sondland of acting maliciously or intentionally putting the country at risk, but she described him as metaphorically driving in an unfamiliar place with no guardrails and no GPS. She raised her concerns with intelligence officials inside the White House. She described her fears that Sondland represented a counterintelligence risk because his actions made him vulnerable to foreign governments who could exploit his inexperience, and that Sondland extensively used a personal cell phone for official diplomatic business and repeatedly told foreign officials they were welcome to drop by the White House any time And apparently, some officials from Romania showed up one day, uninvited, at the Trump White House. There's an interesting report today from ProPublica. They got a hold of some documents related to the Trump Organization, and they detail and confirm that Michael Cohen told the truth when he said that Trump had two sets of books, one for banks to loan him money and the other for the tax man. Write-offs and other expenses were jacked up to lower the tax bill, and those same issues were reduced to show a better bottom line when they were going to the bank for loans. One of the interesting elements pointed out here in the ProPublica article is that Alan Weisselberg, who is the chief financial officer at the Trump Organization, well, his son, Jack Weisselberg, is an executive with Ladder Capital, a $6 billion asset firm that made some pretty big loans to the Trump Organization. Nothing nepotistic or insider about that, would you say? Word from Detroit that General Motors and the UAW have reached a tentative agreement on a new labor contract after the month-long strike. Details have not been released, and it's subject to ratification by the rank and file. Trump has again vetoed a congressional action to end his phony national emergency related to the southern border. It is, as I said, the second time because there is not a veto-proof margin in both houses. 3 American diplomats were arrested and have been released. They were in Russia near the military test site where a mysterious nuclear explosion took place in August. This is near the city of Severodvinsk, and they were picked up on Monday on a train there. Now, they've been identified as military attachés, and essentially those are spies with diplomatic cover. And it's not quite clear what they were investigating near the nuclear incident zone. And finally today, Carrie Lam, the embattled leader of Hong Kong, tried to give her annual policy address to lawmakers, and it wasn't street protesters. It was legislators who jeered at her. They heckled her. They shouted insults. They played audio clips of screaming protesters. And after 2 failed attempts to give her speech, Carrie Lam retreated, and she delivered it by video from a secure location. She did deliver threats. Any acts that advocate Hong Kong's independence. Oh, this is coming from, this is her. Any acts that advocate Hong Kong's independence and threaten the country's sovereignty, security, and development interests will not be tolerated. And it was President Xi who said the other night, anyone attempting to split any part of China will only be ruined. So the rhetoric is still very strong. They don't appear to be giving much other than the offer of better housing and maybe better subsidies for poor people in Hong Kong. But they don't appear to be bending at all to the demands of protesters for a greater democratic voice. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.